Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. In this lecture, we try to introduce how to describe your data. I mean by describing data, presenting your data in tables and graphs. By tables, we have frequency tables, frequency distribution, and graphs, we have different graphs for that. So the main objectives from that lecture, from that chapter 2, in Principles of Statistics. First, how to organize the qualitative data in the frequency tables. So frequency tables for the qualitative data. How to present the frequency tables in specific graphs like the bar chart and the pie chart. How to organize the quantitative data into frequency distribution. So mostly we are using frequency tables for qualitative data and frequency distribution for quantitative data. If from the first lecture we introduced the difference between a qualitative and a quantitative variables. So qualitative variable that you have non-numeric values. A quantitative variable you have numeric values. So if you have a qualitative data, mostly we are saying we have a frequency table. But for the quantitative data, mostly we say we have frequency distribution, and you'll see the difference between them. So for the qualitative data, we have two graphs mainly. We have a bar chart and we have a pie chart. And for the quantitative data, we have a histogram, we have a polygon, and we have a cumulative frequency polygon. Cumulative frequency polygon, sometimes we say O-GIF. So from that slide, you can first point, how I can present the qualitative data in a frequency table. Second point, how I present the frequency table in bar chart and pie chart. A third point, how to present the quantitative data in a frequency distribution. And a third point, how to present, last point, how to present the frequency distribution, which is for the qualitative data in some graphs. You have mainly three graphs. First one, histograms. Second one, the polygons or the frequency polygons. And last one, the cumulative frequency polygons. Cumulative frequency polygons, sometimes we name that as an O-GIF. Okay, in short, you'll find in some references actually they say O-GIF, which means the cumulative frequency polygons. I will see all that with you. So now, that's the main objective from that lecture. So I will introduce all these points, and later on I will add another lecture how to apply that in real examples. So in that lecture we have some examples to show the ideas, and inshallah in the next lecture we have some examples we can solve by ourselves to find out how to apply all these 4 points. So how to visualize your data after finding the frequency tables or the frequency distribution. Okay, so the first point, what is the meaning of the frequency table? Frequency table, just you are grouping your qualitative data into mutually exclusive classes. So you have qualitative data, just counting for each level. So the qualitative data, as we said, for each variable, qualitative, you have specific levels, specific values. Okay, for these values, the non-numeric values, you can group them, and based on that you can find the count, and that count we name it as a frequency. So now look at that very simple example. You have two types of the car. So car type can be domestic or a foreign type. So you can count just how many cars you have in each group, in each mutually exclusive class. Okay, so I will give you one example how you can find that, but that the very simple example what I mean by the frequency table. So you have the qualitative variable levels, and then you have a count for each one of them, and sometimes we name that as the frequency. So you can write that the number of cars, or just say that the frequency in our case. Frequency means you are counting in each level how many values you have. So that's very simply what I mean by the frequency table. If you have a frequency table, then you can visualize that the frequency table into one of two graphs. The first one we name it the bar chart, the second one the pie chart. And by name, bar chart, which means for each level you can introduce one bar. And for the pie chart, you are presenting the frequency values in relative way, and for each level you have one part in the pie. I will see that with you just in a minute. Okay, so So now once you have the frequency values, then you can calculate what I mean by we name it as a relative frequency. So relative frequency, you are plotting each value of the frequency relative to a total. So now for these two types of the cars, okay, so the first one is 50 out of 80, and the second level is 30 out of 80. So that absolute values, we name that frequency, just writing that as a frequency. But indeed, sometimes we need to show the frequency values relative to the total. So 50 relative to 80, and 30 relative to 80, and relative means you are dividing. So now 50 divided by 80 equal 0.625, and 30 divided by 80 equal 0.375, and the sum of these two values has to be 1 because 80 over 80 equal 1. So that the relative frequency or relative class of frequencies means you are putting the frequency values relative to the total. Sometimes we need that. Okay, so in some applications we prefer to present the frequency values in the relative way, and also we can add another one just for your information. Sometimes we like a percent frequency. So percent frequency, a relative frequency times 100, because some people they like the percentage language. يعني الفريكونسي اللي هو بيسموها الجدول التكراري، اما بتبقى فيه الفاليز في شكل تكرارات، يعني بتعد كل ليفل في كام لو في qualitative data طبعا، عشان كده بنسميه frequency table for the qualitative data. خلاص، لكن الفريكونسي فاليوز دي قيم مطلقة. احيانا بنحب نعرض القيم المطلقة في شكل بيانات كنسبة أو كبيانات يعني منسوبة إلى التوتال، فبنسميها التكرار النسبي. يبقى ال 50 مقسوم على ال 80 يديك تكرار نسبي بيسموه relative frequency and so on. آخر point I need to add that actually we name that the percent frequency. Sometimes we like to present the value not as relative frequency only, as percent frequency. Well, percent frequency means relative times 100. Relative times 100. So now the first value of the relative frequency, 0.625, just times 100, that equal 62.5%. And the second value, 37.5%. The sum of these two values now give you 100%. And of course, because 1 times 100 will give you 100%. So that's the percent frequency. So still we are presenting a frequency table for the qualitative data. Once you have the frequency table, frequency values or relative frequency or percent frequency, you can visualize that in one of two graphs as I told you, using a pie chart or using a bar chart. We can see that very simply, that a bar chart. So now for each level you have one bar, so qualitative data. So now a car type is 2 qualitative data. Okay, so you have domestic, you have a foreign type. So based on the frequency table, for a domestic we have a 50, and for the foreign we have 30. So now the bar chart, just you have an x-axis, levels of the variable that you have, and on y-axis the frequency values, count. So for domestic you have 50, and then you have one bar for that, and so on. I will show you one example how to plot by yourself the bar chart. Okay. The second idea, the pie chart. The pie chart, you have one pie circle, and the levels of the variable, it will be parts of that pie, and the size of the part according to the relative frequency for each level. Okay. So we can give you one example for that. So that's the bar chart for the frequency values. Okay, that's the bar chart for the frequency values. How to plot levels on the x-axis, the frequency or relative frequency on the y-axis, and for each level you have one bar, and the height of that bar equal to the frequency value that you have for each level. Very simply. So why we need the bar chart? Because the bar chart simplifying how to compare between the levels of the variable that we have. So now using that bar chart, by one look you can find out what is the highest level, what is the highest frequency, and what is the other distributions of the frequency that you have on the graph. So if you have many values for that variable, if you have different values for that variable, then the bar chart make it easier for you to compare between the values or the levels for that qualitative variable. That's the main objective. Make it easy to compare between the frequencies of all the classes or the levels of the variable that you have. Okay? The pie chart almost the same, but in the pie chart we don't have bars. We have one pie, one circle, and dividing that circle into parts for the classes or for the levels of the variable that you have, and the size of the part according to the relative frequency for that level. Okay, I will show you in details how we can plot the pie chart, but that's the idea. El pie, one circle, okay, and you have in that circle you have different parts, each part for the level that you have of the variable, and the size of the part equal to a relative frequency of that level that you have. And just you can see how we can compare between the classes or the levels for that variable. It's easy actually. يبقى رسمة الأعمدة البار تشارت بنسميها رسم الأعمدة. يبقى عندك هنا بشكل مختصر لكل قيمة للمتغير في بار في عمود، وبيبقى الارتفاع العمود ده بيساوي الفريكونسي فاليو، وبالتالي تبقى القيم بتاعة الفريكونسي معكوسة على ارتفاعات الأعمدة، عشان كده بنسميها الايه البار تشارت. أما الباي تشارت الفكرة مختلفة. عندك باي بيسموها رسمة الدايرة، إن الدايرة متقسمة إلى أجزاء، الأجزاء دي بتساوي قيم المتغير اللي عندك Qualitative variable. هنتكلم على Qualitative variable، وهنا كل جزء هيبقى الحجم بتاعه بيساوي تقريبا relative frequency. يعني كل ما يكون الفاليو ليها high relative frequency the size of that level it will be high in that pie. خلاص، يبقى هنا بيديك in somehow relative comparison between the levels or the classes that you have for that variable. وبرضه still نفس الobjective، البار تشارت والباي تشارت بتساعدنا اكثر على ازاي نقارن ما بين المستويات الفاريبل او بين قيم الفاريبل. طيب طبعا هنا in that lecture notes I'm giving you from the textbook how to use Excel. I will return back for that. يعني ازاي نرسم الكلام ده بالاكسل، هنشوف ده برنامج الاكسل ازاي نستخدمه، وبعدين ان شاء الله ده ممكن يعني يكون جزء من المنهج، لكن لاحقا هنبص على how we can use the software to find all these graphs. Now come to the idea of the frequency distribution. The frequency distribution for the quantitative data. You are grouping the quantitative data in some groups or classes or intervals, and for each class you find how many values you have. So now I will give you that idea. Assuming you have, so before that point, later on I will turn back for what the meaning of the class midpoint, class frequency, class interval. لكن الفريكونسي ديستريبيوشن بشكل مختصر لما يكون عندك قيم رقمية أو قيم كمية بتحاول تقسمها إلى فئات أو مجموعات، وبتعد في كل فئة في كام رقم. يعني مثلا هنا بتكلم على selling prices in thousands. هنا المينيمم value for selling price 15,000 والماكسيمم 36,000. You have many values because you have a quantitative data. So now we cannot count for each value and find the frequency. No, the best way to make the table small and you have useful table, you have to put the values in classes. You have to group your data in mutually exclusive classes. So now we divide the values in some classes. Class 1 from 15 to 18, and then from 18 to 21, and then from 21 to 24, and so on. How to find the number of classes and how to find the class length or interval, that will be actually what I will explain now. But anyway, for the qualitative data, because you have a few values, just count each value. Like in car type, you have only 2, just count how many cars in type 1 and how many cars in type 2. But for the quantitative data, like selling prices, because you have quantitative data, so you have many values, we cannot count each value, but what we can do, the other way, we can put the data in some classes or groups, and you count how many values you have inside that group. So now look at this data. So we divided the selling prices into 7 groups, The first group from 15,000 to less than 18 or up to 18, and then from 18 to 21, and so on. If you count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you have 7 intervals. The first interval includes all the values from 15 up to 18. And just to count how many values for selling prices between 15 and 18, you'll find them equal 8. I will show you a raw data for that table and how we constructed that table. That table, the final outcome, the final output. So how we decided how many classes we have, how many groups, and what is the length of each group. All that we can be actually discussed later on now in our lecture, how to construct the frequency table from a number of classes and then a length for each class, and then count how many values you have in each class. Okay, so that point I will now discuss in some detail. So for that frequency table, sometimes we introduce that a class 1 and that a class 2 and that a class 3. Okay, a class 1, a midpoint means the value in the middle of that class. So now from 15 to 18, okay, what is the midpoint from 15 and 18? So we'll find that will be 16.5. So a midpoints means the middle values for each class. So now I have 3 points I have to set. The class midpoint, a point that divides a class into 2 equal parts. The second, the class of frequency, you are counting how many values you have in each class. And the class interval, later on I need that. The class interval very similar to the class length, but we have some difference between them. But anyway, the class midpoint معناها هنا منتصف الكلاس أو منتصف الفئة. لو سمينا الكلاس الفئة مفيش مشكلة، أو الفترة يبقى الكلاس midpoint يعني منتصف الفترة. الكلاس فريكونسي يعني تكرار كل فئة أو كل فترة. الكلاس انترفال تقدر تقول عليها طول الفترة أو طول الفئة. خلاص؟ يعني لو رجعنا تاني ليه frequency table، الكلاس interval most it will be from 15 to 18. that الانترفال يبقى 18 minus 15 equal 3. الكلاس midpoint between 15 and 18 and almost 16.5. الكلاس frequency or the frequency inside each class. I will return back for that and how we construct a table based on that idea. Okay, so how to construct the table, frequency table. That frequency table, how we can construct the frequency table. So that's raw data for the frequency table that we had before. So now return back. That's the frequency table. Okay, that's the frequency table constructed from the raw data that we have now. That's the raw data. How to construct or how to create the frequency distribution table. So we have the first point, you have to specify how many classes you have, how many classes you need. And second, the length or the interval for each class. And third, you find the frequency inside each class. So now put that in some systematic way. So step 1, you have to decide the number of classes. We have one rule saying that 2 to power k greater than n. N actually that is the number of values that you have. And 2 to power k, k هو number of classes. Assuming a number of classes will be k in the last frequency table k equals 7. يعني في الجدول اللي احنا شفناه من شوية كان k هو عدد الكلاسز، يعني كان 7. ازاي هتحدد عدد الكلاسز عندك؟ الحقيقة في رول بتقول لك 2 to power k greater than n. يعني هتفترض ال k هو ال unknown، قيمة مجهولة، وال n هو ال number of values that you have. فانت هتشوف ال k اللي بتحقق الكونديشن ده ان 2 to power k greater than n. هنشوف نطبق ده على المثال من شوية. احنا عندنا كان من شوية 80 observations، كان في 80 قيمة. ال 80 قيمة دول هو ده ال n. يبقى انا عايز k اللي تخلي لي 2 to power k اكبر من 80. لو جربنا ال 6 مثلا يبقى 2 to power 6 ده هيديك ايه؟ 64. لكن 2 to power 7 هيديك 128 وده اكبر من ال 80. يبقى هنا roughly speaking how to specify number for classes. assume ان عندك 2 to power k، نعملها بشكل بسيط. هتشوف الاول ال n عندك بكام. في المثال بتاعنا كان ال n ب 80. فكأن في معادلة كده ان انا عايز 2 to power number of classes اللي هو ال k لازم يكون اكبر من ال 80. هنا طبعا trial and error او using الكالكوليتر. what is the value of k اللي تخلي لي 2 to power k greater than 80؟ then ال K هتبقى هو number of classes for that data that you need to construct the frequency table. يعني أنا عندي دلوقتي 80 قيمة عايز أعمل لهم جدول تكراري، هنحطهم في كام فئة؟ ده أول ستيب. بشكل بسيط تحل المعادلة دي. طبعا لو جربت ال K ب6 2 to power 6 ده هيديك 64. طبعا ده is not greater than 80، ده أقل من 80. طب نجرب ال 7 2 to power 7 that will give you 128 that of course greater than 80. يبقى then we can use ال K equal 7. يبقى أول ستيب طلعنا إن ال K إن عدد الكلاسز في الجدول أو الجدول التكراري أو التوزيع التكراري اللي احنا هنعمله يساوي 7. دي step 1. Once you have a number of classes, you need to find the length or the width for each class. How we can do that? In the same way. Step 2. Find the class interval or width. How to find that? We have one rule saying إنه ال width equal the highest value minus the minimum value divided by ال K. يعني هتشوف أكبر قيمة عندك في البيانات ناقص أصغر قيمة عندك في البيانات مقسومة على قيمة ال K اللي أنت لسه محددها حالا اللي كانت في حالتنا 7. لو بصيت في التيبل اللي فيه رو داتا اللي شفناه من شوية هتلاقي أكبر قيمة 35,926.25 and the smallest value أو minimum value 15,546. The difference between these two values divide by 7 هيديك تقريبا 2,911. طبعا يعني we prefer to round that for يعني ايه for you can round that for convenient number. means convenient number يعني ما تخليش اللينث بالشكل ده بتاع الانترفال او الويدث، يعني ممكن تبقى تخليه في رقم صحيح. convenient number يعني رقم سهل استخدامه لكن still close to 2,900. يعني ممكن تقرب ده الى ايه؟ الى اما 2,900 او directly تخليه 3,000 وده actually more convenient value 3,000. يبقى number of classes equal 7 وال width of the class equal 3,000. That is step 2. Step 3, now you can construct a table. In each class you can find the frequency, or first find the classes and then find the A and then find the interval. That will at the end will give you the frequency table that we have. So now we can see that. Okay, so now constructing the frequencies. How to construct the class limits? As we said, the minimum 15 and then the width or the interval 3,000, then from 15 to 18 and then from 18 to 21 and so on. So that give you 7 classes, okay, approximated in somehow. And then you have to find the frequency inside each class. Very simple. You count how many values from 15 to 18, you'll find in 8 and so on. So now if you return back, so please now, assuming you have that classes intervals and how to count, very simply now we are using softwares. Okay, I will not give you all these numbers and then ask you to find the frequency table. يعني لو انا في سؤال هسألك على الفريكونسي تيبل بالمنطق، يعني في الكورس بتاعنا مش هديك النمبرز دي كلها اقول لك construct the frequency table. لا، that in reality we are using softwares. بنستخدم softwares عشان تعمل constructing للفريكونسي تيبل. يبقى هنا في الداتا دي هتشوف كده كم رقم كم قيمة ما بين 15,000 و 18,000. لو عملت كده هتلاقيهم 8 values. So please just try to check for the first class. يعني اتأكد بس كده أول first class إنه هنلقى ده التيبل بتاعنا الفاينل احنا في the first أهو from 15 to 18 ده equal 8. Okay, and then count how many from 18 to 21,000. You'll find 23 and so on. That will give you the frequency distribution. يبقى frequency table for the qualitative data and we say frequency distribution for the quantitative data. So that's the idea. So you have 4 steps or 5. Step 1, find how many classes you have using a rule 2 to power k greater than n, will n the number of values that you have. Step 2, you have to find the class interval or the class width, the maximum minus minimum divided by number of classes that you have in step 1. Step 3, find the classes for all the data, finds limits or the class limits. the start and the end for each class. Still you have approximation. Step 4 and 5 just to count in each class how many values you have. Then now we have the frequency table. That the initial frequency distribution table. We can add a relative frequency, we can add the percent frequency, we can add the cumulative frequency. Yani that table you can add many columns adding more information. So that the frequency, if I need to find a relative frequency, each value relative to total. If I need to find the percent frequency, relative frequency times 100. And later on I will introduce one idea for you, the cumulative frequency, accumulating the values that you have from the value you can accumulate the values. So 18 plus the previous values 8, 23 plus the previous value 8, previous values 23 plus 8, and so on. So I will return back for that point. What is the meaning of the frequency table? Okay, so that the last step, as we said, we have the frequency table. Now, as I said, we can add another columns. We can add a relative frequency, each value relative to total, 8 divided by 80, and so on. So that giving you a relative frequency distribution. Similar to a relative frequency in the frequency table, each value relative to the total, presenting your data or your information in different form. Sometimes we can add a percent frequency, as we said. So now, for the qualitative data, we have a bar chart and we have a pie chart. For the quantitative data, we have 3 graphs. We have a histogram, we have a frequency polygon, we have a cumulative frequency distribution. As I told you before, a cumulative frequency distribution, sometimes we name that OGIF. Okay, so whatever the name that you have, so still a cumulative frequency distributions, that means you have a graph based on the cumulative frequency. It's very famous to use a histogram to present the distribution of your data. So now look at that. So that the histogram for our frequency distribution for the selling prices. So selling prices for some cars, we put that in some intervals, in first class or interval from 15 to 18 and so on. So in histogram, very simply, you are plotting the classes on the x-axis and you are plotting the frequency values or the relative frequency on the y-axis, and that giving you the distribution of your data. So the frequency histogram in somehow try to present the distribution of the values for the variable under study, and based on that distribution you can decide what you can observe. You have symmetric data, you have a skew to the right, you have a skew to the left. So I will return back how I can use the histogram to evaluate the distribution of the data that you have and to evaluate the skewness in your data. Okay, so one point, the histogram is very important graph in statistics. You can use it to see the distribution in your data. By one look you can see all the distribution. Okay, but if you have a frequency distribution table, then you need to investigate the values, but the graph make it easy for you. Just by one look you can see the distribution for your data. You can get more information. You can find out what about the distribution, do you have any extreme values, you have symmetric or skewed data, and all that it will be in using the histogram. So the histogram, plotting your data in classes and then visualizing the frequency or the relative frequency for your data. So how to plot the histogram using Excel? As I told you before, we can return back for the software and how we can use the software to find out all the graphs that we have in our course. So a polygon the same as a histogram, but you have a straight line crossing the midpoints for the histogram. So now if I return back for the histogram for this data, and now imagine we have that the midpoints, the value in the middle in your class. Okay, that the midpoints, value in the middle in your class. Okay, just to be starting values and ending values. So now if you have a straight line crossing the midpoints for your histogram, we name that the polygon. يبقى polygon just straight line crossing the midpoints for the histogram. So if you look at the bars, that will be your histogram. If you are looking at the straight line crossing the midpoints, the blue line that we have now, then you have a polygon. So what I need to say, a polygon introducing the same information that you have in the histogram, just in different way, using a straight line crossing midpoints, or you have bars for each class. So bars, that will be histogram, and a straight line, that will be a polygon, but at the end you have the same information, no difference, just how we can introduce your data. يبقى كلمة الهيستوجرام بنترجمها بالعربي المدرج التكراري، وان بيبقى لكل كلاس او كل انترفال او كل فئة ليها بار، نفس فكرة البار تشارت. الفرق ما بين الهيستوجرام والبار تشارت ان البار تشارت للكواليتيتيف داتا، وبالتالي بيبقى فيه فرق ما بين كل بار وبار، في جاب، في فجوة، ان الكواليتيتيف داتا بتبقى ليفلز منفصلة، اما الكوانتيتيف داتا بتبقى في شكل كلاسز، يعني في شكل انترفالز، وبالتالي مفيش ما بينهم فروقات، يعني there is no gap between البارز. خلاص؟ يبقى الهيستوجرام للكواليتيتيف داتا والبار تشارت للكوانتيتيف، لكن تقريبا نفس الرسمه، الفرق انت عندك كلاسز ولا عندك قيم منفصله. البوليجون الحقيقه هو نفس رسمه الهيستوجرام، لكن بنبص على الخط المستقيم اللي بيقطع الميد بوينتس بتاعه الكلاسز، لكن بيقدم نفس الانفورميشن. خلاص؟ يعني ممكن على نفس الرسمه ترسم الهيستوجرام والبوليجون just to simplify الايديا، عشان الموضوع سهل. لكن السؤال المهم جدا، احنا محتاجين الهيستوجرام او البوليجون ليه؟ to show the distribution of your data. عايز اشوف توزيع القيم، توزيع البيانات عامله ازاي، فين اعلى frequencies وفين اقل frequencies، الديستريبيوشن نفسه هل هو متماثل سيمتريك ولا بيروح ناحيه اللي فيه skewed to the right ولا skewed to the left. فالبوينت دي هرجع لها تاني بالتفصيل، يعني ايه توزيع البيانات ويعني ايه سيمتريك يعني ايه سكيود، هرجع لده بالتفصيل ان شاء الله في المحاضره اللي هنعمل فيها ابلكيشنز. خلاص هنعمل ابلكيشنز، هنحل امثله ونطلع الهيستوجرام واعمل الكومباريزون دي، لكن خليك فاكر ان الهيستوجرام من اهم الرسومات في الاحصاء الحقيقه. طيب كده we finalized الهيستوجرام والبوليجون. اوكي. Sometimes we like to plot the cumulative values of frequency, not only the frequency. That for the frequency values or relative frequency. Sometimes we like to plot to add more information and getting more information from a cumulative frequency and visualizing a cumulative frequency. In that case, we say we have cumulative frequency distribution or cumulative frequency polygon or cumulative frequency histogram. Different names for the same idea. Okay, what is the meaning of the cumulative? You are accumulating the values that you have. You are accumulating the values that you have. So now for the first value, for the first class 15 to 18, you have frequency 8. So that's the first value, or that's the frequency for the first class. The second class is 23 as a frequency. So now if you are accumulating the values of the frequency, يعني each frequency, and you are adding each frequency to all the previous values, in that case we say we have cumulative frequency. So the value 8, there's no frequency values before, it will be 8, second value 23, 23 plus 8, 31, and so on. You are accumulating the values of the frequency for the variable that you have. So accumulating, assuming you have a data ordered ascending. يبقى for the cumulative frequency, only informative for the quantitative data. يبقى في حالة لما تكون عندك البيانات quantitative وبقى عندك sorted data، يعني بتبدأ من أقل ليفل إلى أعلى ليفل، تقدر تعمل accumulating للفريكونسي values، ويبقى ليها معنى هنا الحقيقة إن you are finding the cumulative frequency for the data that you have. And sometimes you plot that in one graph, we name it as a cumulative frequency distribution. I will return back for that graph to show you why we need it. هنرجع للجراف ده بعدين، هنشوف ليه محتاجين ال cumulative frequency distribution. يبقى now in that lecture I introduced first how to present the qualitative data in frequency table and how to visualize the qualitative data in bar chart and pie chart. Second, I show how to present the quantitative data in a frequency distribution table and how to construct the frequency distribution table. In step 1, find the number of classes. Step 2, find a length or an interval or a width for each class. Step 3, find all the classes. Step 4 and 5, you are counting how many values the frequency in each class. And then we finalized our lecture how to visualize the quantitative data using histograms, using polygon, and using cumulative frequency distribution. That the graph we have, and that in summary. In next lecture it will be how I can use these ideas to solve some questions. I will give you examples for qualitative data, how we construct the frequency table, and then visualize and answer some questions from the frequency tables and the graphs that we have. Okay, and I will discuss why we need the histogram and how we can compare between different histograms to get more information about the distribution of the data. يبقى احنا في المحاضرة دي بشكل بسيط ومختصر الحقيقة اتكلمت على أكتر من نقطة. هحاول ألخص تاني الكلام اللي أنا قلته عشان ده مهم للمحاضرة اللي جاية، اللي أنا هبدأ أحل أمثلة على نفس الكلام. يبقى احنا في الأول قلنا إزاي نعرض البيانات الكواليتيتيف أو الكيفية في شكل جدول تكراري، وبعدين بنعرض الجدول التكراري في شكل إما بار تشارت رسمة أعمدة أو باي تشارت بنسميها رسم الدائرة. والكوانتيتيف داتا اتكلمنا على في حاجه اسمها الفريكونسي ديستريبيوشن تيبل، انك بتحاول الكوانتيتيف داتا تحطها في شكل جدول تكراري بسيط ومفيد بنسميه التوزيع التكراري، وده مهم جدا. هيبقى عندك في تشالنج ازاي هتعرض الكوانتيتيف داتا في عدد معين من الفئات او الكلاسز. فقلنا في عندي 4 أو 5 خطوات بتمشي فيهم. الخطوه الاولى بتحدد عدد الفئات او الكلاسز باستخدام القاعده 2 to power k greater than n. طبعا في اكثر من قاعده الحقيقه لكن دي ابسطهم. 2 to power k greater than n بتحدد ال k على حسب ال n الموجوده. السكند ستيب find for each class الويدث او الانترفال، يعني كل فئه بتجيب لها طول الفئه. بتجيبها ازاي؟ ان الهايست فاليو او الماكسيمم ماينس المينيمم اوفر الكي، يعني اكبر قيمه في البيانات عندك ناقص اصغر قيمه في البيانات عندك مقسوما على عدد الفئات اللي انت جبته في الخطوه رقم 1. الخطوه رقم 3 انك بتحاول الحقيقه تجيب كل الكلاس ليميتس، يعني كل الايه الفئات اللي عندك تجيب البدايه والنهايه على حسب عدد الفئات اللي انت حددته وعلى حسب طول الفئه اللي انت برضو حددته في الخطوه رقم 2. بعد كده الخطوة رقم 4 و5 مع بعض الحقيقة بيبقى خطوة واحدة، انك انت بتحاول تجيب في كل فئة كام قيمة الفريكونسي in each class. Once you have the frequency distribution table تقدر تعرض ده في شكل histogram very similar to the bar chart to show a distribution of your data. You can find the polygon and you can find the cumulative frequency distribution. المحاضرة الجاية ان شاء الله على طول هنبدأ how to apply these ideas in some data. I will give you raw data for the qualitative and quantitative and ask you how we can find the frequency table, how we can present that and visualize that. هنشوف ده ان شاء الله في المحاضرة اللي جاية. شكرا لكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.